Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas. And his Catholic faith is day 286. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 57 and 58 of the supplement to the Summa, that is, of legal relationship, which is by adoption, and of the impediments of impotence, spell frenzy, or madness, incest, and defective age. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5 volumes set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code Summa 10, and so here we go. Article 1, whether adoption is rightly defined. Our definition given is the following. Adoption is the act by which a person lawfully takes for his child or grandchild and so on one who does not belong to him. St. Thomas says this is a fitting definition because just like in natural procreation, there is a wherefrom and a whereto, wherefrom being the material given by one's parents and the whereto, the form given by God, our immortal soul. So too with adoption, we have a wherefrom in our definition, one who does not belong to him, and a whereto, takes for his child or grandchild. Therefore, by including both ends of this movement of the change in adoption, St. Thomas says, the above definition is rightly defined. Article 2, whether a tie that is an impediment to marriage is contracted through adoption. And this is the case. The adopted child is related to the family in such a way that it serves as an impediment to marriage to other members of that family. And we can see why this would be the case based on the temptation to sins of concupiscence, as we've mentioned in previous episodes. And a word from St. Thomas here. The divine law especially forbids marriage between those persons who have to live together, lest, as Rabbi Moses observes, if it were lawful for them to have carnal intercourse, there would be more room for concupiscence, to the repression of which marriage is directed. And since the adopted child dwells in the house of his adopted father, like one that is begotten naturally, human laws forbid the contracting of marriage between the like, and this prohibition is approved by the Church. Article 3, whether a legal relationship is contracted only between the adopting father and the adopted child. St. Thomas says here that the relationship between the adoptive father and their child not only affects them, but also the adopted father's wife as well, and the adopted father's children, as well as with the adopted child's, their own children, if they have any. Because of this, there can be no marriage between any of these except the father's kid with the adopted child after the father dies, or the adopted child reaches an appropriate age and is no longer under the parent's dominion. This is the opinion of St. Thomas, who writes, so long as the adopted person remains under the power of the adoptive father, wherefore when the father dies, or when the child comes of age, they can be married. We turn then to our next question, which is question 58 of the impediments of impotence, spell, frenzy, or madness, incest, and defective age. Article 1, whether impotence is an impediment to marriage. And the impotence discussed here is not that of sterility, because Aquinas admits that it would be lawful for an older person, an older woman, for example, who can no longer have children, to still marry, as he says. Although old people have not sufficiency to procreate, they have sufficiency to copulate, wherefore they are allowed to marry insofar as marriage is intended as a remedy, although it does not befit them as fulfilling an office of nature. Therefore, the impotence our article is concerned with specifically would be, for example, if a man doesn't have the reproductive faculties to carry out the marital act, or if his reproductive faculties, which he does have, are somehow enabled to carry out that act. This is what impotence means in this article. And since impotence wouldn't allow the person to carry out the marriage debt, which one is agreeing to, and the marital consent, such impotence would void the marital consent. Article 2, whether a spell can be an impediment to marriage. And it's probably best to quote St. Thomas on this one. He will quote the Decretals, which was used as a source for canon law in his day. He writes, it is stated in the Decretals, if by sorcerers or witches, and further on, if they be incurable, they must be separated. Further, the demon's power is greater than man's. There is no power upon earth that can be compared with him who has made to fear no one. Now, through the action of man, a person may be rendered incapable of carnal copulation by some power or by castration, and this is an impediment to marriage. Therefore, much more can this be done by the power of a demon. Article 3, whether madness is an impediment to marriage. We can simply quote St. Thomas on this question as well, which is very brief. The madness is either previous or subsequent to marriage. If subsequent, it no ways voids the marriage. But if it be previous, then the mad person either has the lucid intervals or not. If he has, then although it is not safe for him to marry during that interval, since he would not know how to educate his children, yet if he marries, the marriage is valid. But if he has no lucid intervals or marries outside a lucid interval, then since there can be no consent without use of reason, the marriage will be invalid. Article 4, whether marriage is annulled by the husband committing incest with his wife's sister. Kind of interesting. This would annul a marriage according to St. Thomas, since as St. Paul said, "Do you not know that he who joins himself to a prostitute becomes one body with her? Therefore, if a man becomes one flesh with a woman's sister through fornication, then he cannot then marry this woman, the woman whose sister he had fornication with." In St. Thomas's words, by knowing his future wife's sister, he contracts affinity with his wife, but affinity voids the marriage contract, therefore the aforesaid incest does also. Article 5 in our last article, whether defective age is an impediment to marriage. And our response here will again hearken back to the necessity of being physically capable of paying the marriage debt in order to be validly married. Thus, St. Thomas says, a decretal says that a boy who is incapable of marriage intercourse is unfit to marry, but in the majority of cases he cannot pay the marriage debt before the age of 14, therefore, etc. And with that, we come to the close of another episode. We have just finished covering questions 57 and 58 of the supplement to the Summa, that is of legal relationship, which is by adoption, and of the impediments of impotence, spell, frenzy, or madness, incest, and defective age. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.